Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Dirt Destinations in Real Time. My name is Blake Ryder. I am getting over a bit of a cold. I have not talked for the last 48 hours, storing up this vocal power so I can project for you guys because the show must go on. Welcome. And opposite me, as always, Mr. Daniel Foreman. Daniel, please introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. I am Daniel Foreman, a commercial strategist here at Lighthouse. Excited to go over some destination data with you guys today and talk all things benchmarking.
Yes, today we are talking about effective strategies to benchmark, how to select your comp set, how to benchmark appropriately, what metrics to look at, how to consider the data you see, all that good stuff. Also, today, just so you know, we have Vince in the chat. So if you have any questions in real time, you can feel free to post those in the chat, and we have Vince right in the chat to answer them in real time. A quick slide about us. If this is your first time joining one of our webinars or you're not familiar with who we are, we're Lighthouse, over 70,000 hotels, 185 countries. We are a all-in-one hotel and hospitality and destination commercial platform. Feel free to pause your video if you're watching this after the fact and see, but that is who we are. And with that, let's get into our presentation for today. So, quick kind of overview of the roadmap before we get into it. First, we're going to start off with how to select destinations to benchmark against. It's very different picking destinations to benchmark against versus hotels in a more traditional hotel comp set. So we'll start off with that. We'll look at then some data for destinations that are nearby and like kind of proximate destinations and how to consider that and how to consider both sides of the equation when you're nearby another major city. We'll look at how segmentation might impact the destinations you pick and how to consider the segmentation data when you're benchmarking. And then we'll also look at some markets that might seem similar on the surface and perhaps appropriate to benchmark against. But once you kind of peel back the layers of the onion and get underneath the hood, maybe it's not the best, or at least things you have to consider if you're making those selections. So, Daniel, you ready?
Let's do this.
Let's do it. Okay. We will first start off with talking through how to identify destinations to benchmark against. Now, Daniel, the most basic kind of, layup one would just be geography and proximity. Could you talk through that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just a little background on me. Like, I come from the hotel revenue management world, and there's a lot of overlap. And there's obviously some things that are different between, destination benchmarking and hotel benchmarking. But one thing that's important for both is geography and proximity. So in the hotel world, if you've got a hotel that's right across the street, well, you should probably have it in your competitive set, right? So the exact same thing applies to destinations as well. So if you've got a similar destination that's very, very close, maybe a few hours driving or a short flight away, they might be really good to have in your benchmark just if they're close. Proximity a lot of times is really one of the most important things.
Totally. And as we'll get into shortly in the presentation, sometimes those proximate cities are spot on, and some you have to mentally just think about what you need to consider if you are benchmarking against a nearby destination, just knowing that some of the composition of the city might differ. Next, number of hotel rooms. Now, this might not just, there's a couple factors at play with this. First, obviously, the actual just number of rooms. If you are trying to attract a certain conference to your market or a certain number of people or a group, you need to have the hotel rooms to support it. So you want to make sure you're benchmarking against other destinations that have a similar sizing, so you know you're kind of competing for similar sizes of groups and similar conventions. But it's not only the number of rooms. Daniel, walk me through when we say distribution of rooms, what does that mean?
Yeah, distribution of rooms is also important because different markets, they may be a similar size, but they may have a completely different breakdown of, say, 3-star versus 4-star versus 5-star properties, right? So when you're comparing your destination to another, you always want to make sure that you're comparing, to use a cliche, the apples to apples. If you're in a luxury Mediterranean market with a lot of 5-star ultra luxury properties, it may not be super useful to look at another destination that has a bunch of 3-star properties. It may just not be the right fit for you.
Perfect. I mean, if you think about it, if you're trying to attract a brain surgeon convention, and you have a lot of 5-star and 4-star products, you want to make sure that you're benchmarking against another market that theoretically could support that type of convention. That's exactly right.
Exactly.
And then lastly, the convention center itself, the kind of your proximity to your convention center, the hotel rooms surrounding the convention center, and again, that distribution around that. Because at the end of the day, the convention center is largely going to be driving a lot of those groups, a lot of those big conferences and such. And are there ballrooms, for example? A lot of conventions use nearby 4-star and 5-star properties. They use those ballrooms at those properties to use for like overflow type room sessions and whatnot. So, am I benchmarking against a city that has a similar general construct of their convention center and the surroundings? So, these are all kind of the key things that you're going to be wanting to think about. And with that, let's dive into some actual data now. Okay. So, what I have here coming through. Okay, Daniel.
Yep, all looking good.
Perfect. Okay. So this is our performance dashboard on our data solutions dashboard. Okay. So this is Lighthouse's data solutions product. And we're going to be using this to kind of pull and analyze and discuss real-time data and use this to kind of drive our discussion. So let's just start off with some proximate cities. Let's look at Dallas. Daniel, you're in Dallas, right? You haven't moved since a couple of days ago, right? You're still chilling in Dallas.
Yep, my
Excellent. Okay,
hometown,
cool.
for
You
sure.
never know if you moved yesterday. Okay, Dallas and Houston. Let's pick a couple of major. These are obviously major cities, right? About 240 miles apart from each other, and let's just talk about at the surface, like you're Houston, you're Dallas. Okay, let's just say for an example, College Station, a city in the middle. This is a city, College Station, where if a business there wanted to host like a major convention and they wanted to be near a major airport, for example, for people to fly in, they were expecting a lot of out of towners. They would probably pick Dallas or Houston because those are the two major cities. They're kind of in the middle, right, Daniel? So if you are in this type of situation, you're going to be competing for this type of customer, this type of group.
Exactly. Yeah. And so this is a really good example of proximity where if you are Dallas, then you probably want to look at Houston, again, just based on that mileage, right? Only 240 miles away. But some other things to consider too. This means that if you're Houston, you also want to look at Dallas. And if you're San Antonio, you probably want to look at Dallas. And then if you're Houston, you want to look at San Antonio and all those different combinations, right? Because proximity is so important. So if you're going to host, say, a convention in Texas, Dallas and Houston, companies really do compare those two destinations because they're very, very similar, right? Most of the year, the weather is very comparable. Convention spaces, there's some differences, but for the most part, a convention that you can have in Dallas, typically you can also have in Houston. And then more so for the leisure side, there's also a lot of really good demand drivers that kind of appeal to most corporate travelers for, some of the kind of more like the leisure breakouts and, stuff like that. There's a lot of similar amenities and similar attractions in the two cities. So really important for these two markets to pay attention to each other.
Totally. And you really hit the nail on the head there because I think when a lot of destinations are benchmarking, they're really focused on that group, the convention business, but there definitely is leisure benchmarking as well. I mean, if someone wants to take their family on a Texas vacation, presumably Dallas and Houston are definitely going to be at least in the conversation for possible cities. I mean, honestly, it's similar to Orlando and Miami, a similar distance apart, about 240 miles, both heavy leisure cities providing very different experiences. One is the theme parks in Orlando, one is going to be your nightlife and your restaurants and such in Miami. But at the end of the day, if someone wants to go to Florida for a vacation, they will probably be thinking about those too. So let's look at the data now. So if you're Dallas and you're Houston, what we have here, you can see a couple of different data kind of tables. The first one is occupancy forward looking, and you have occupancy last year. And in both situations, your blue is going to be your Dallas and your yellow is going to be Houston, right? So when you're benchmarking and you're kind of looking forward and you're looking at last year, it's important to factor in who typically is the occupancy or rate leader, right? Because it's not necessarily about always beating your competitors, although obviously we are as hoteliers, we're always trying to strive to get the highest demand, highest rate, highest occupancy. But, sometimes intrinsically, one market just outperforms the other in terms of rate, for example. So if you know that you're generally the rate leader, or are you always exceeding your competitors by that amount? Or if you generally trail, are you trailing by the amount you usually trail by, or are you gaining? Even though you're behind, are you gaining ground? Daniel, talk to me about Dallas versus Houston. You're the boots on the ground expert on these numbers. Talk to me about what you see here in Dallas versus Houston.
Yeah, I mean, everything you just said definitely applies. And it's really good to look at these competing destinations, just for a lot of reasons. But the one that sticks out to me is over time, you really learn about your competitors and you learn what's normal for them, right? So, for example, you kind of see this a little bit on the far right of this chart, but you can see where Houston is starting to have a little bit of pickup maybe for like the rodeo that they're going to get in February, right? So if I'm in Dallas, I know that I don't also have that exact same event, but that event, if I'm watching it in Houston, that can kind of be like the canary in the coal mine for me. So if I know what's normal for Houston for the rodeo, and I see that they're pacing way behind where they were same time last year for the rodeo, or if they're way out in front, a lot of times that can be a good leading indicator for me sitting here in Dallas as to what I
Uh-huh.
can expect from a similar event. If I have the rodeo later in the year or something like that. But you can see here, like you just pulled up, like all these really cool spikes, right? Where you can see in mid-January, where we've got some events going on at AT&T, where you've got these little spikes here, where we're leading the pack. And if I'm Houston, it's also valuable for me to look at those events to kind of get a gauge for how my events might be going at NRG Stadium later in the year.
Uh-huh. Now let me ask you another question, Daniel. So, like what understanding who typically outperforms, because obviously if you look at the last year, I mean, this is critically important as a destination. You can generally see, it looks like in December, at least early December last year, Dallas outperformed Houston decently well. And then again, Dallas outperforming Houston, you could see that kind of tracks how Dallas is outperforming there. But I mean, just look here. This is like, I'm looking at this, and you see this stretch in early December, Dallas definitely outperformed Houston, but I mean these are days that are right around the corner. We see on the books Houston is outperforming Dallas after Dallas was outperforming Houston. So, I mean, I guess looking further in the future, you could see like here, Dallas ahead of Houston here, Houston ahead of Dallas in terms of current on the books. But there's enough lead time that, Dallas may know that they have higher pickup closer to the stay dates. But here, I mean, this is just in a couple of weeks. I mean, if you're Dallas and you see this, are you concerned that your pickup is not there, or are you just business as usual, knowing that it's going to come?
Yeah, I mean, I might be concerned. I mean, that's probably a little bit too immediate to kind of steer the ship and make a change now. But if I notice something like that, I would look for dates that are more 6 months, 9 months, 12 months in advance. And that is where, if I'm pacing way behind Houston and that's not normal, maybe we deploy some marketing spend. Maybe we try to change that now to get ahead of the curve.
Totally. Yeah, that's good stuff. And so obviously this is focused on your proximate cities. And what's interesting, we talked about kind of how different benchmarking for destinations is versus benchmarking for hotels, because hotels is always proximate. This is always what you're looking at. For hotels, we were talking about this, Daniel. The one really concrete example I think of hotels where proximity doesn't matter as much, there are some resort types hotel properties where they're so contained in the sense that like the resort is the destination, not the destination where the resort is located. So like I know there are some like super high end, super luxe destination type resorts where regardless of where the resort is, people are going to go there. So for those types of resorts, those are the ones where you might have a resort in the East Coast benchmarking against the West Coast, only because again, those are like these exclusive resorts where the resort itself is the attraction. It's not like pick a destination and then pick where I want to, what hotel at the destination. So
Hmm.
proximity is an interesting one. So, but obviously, listen, there's no harm in you should. It's not even that there's no harm. You should be picking multiple destinations to benchmark against, right? This is the example that we dove into for proximity. And now let's actually shift gears and look at how proximity might be impacted a bit by segmentation. Okay, so it's not only the proximity, it's the proximity, but factoring in how the composition of the market might actually impact it. So for this, I want to pick up Munich and I want to look at Frankfurt. Okay. So again, both in Germany. Okay. But these are cities that might have a bit of a different kind of composition. And again, factoring in this segmentation will impact how you look and how you benchmark and frankly how you communicate to stakeholders, because again, stakeholders always want to know how you're doing against your benchmarks. Well, putting that data into context, right, contextualizing that data is critical, right? So Daniel, we have Munich, we have Frankfurt pulled up, we have our segmentation window, which again is at the bottom of our performance dashboard from Lighthouse Data Solutions. Please walk me through this.
All right, so why are we looking at Munich and Frankfurt? So if you are from Germany or have ever been to Germany or know about these two cities, we picked these because Frankfurt in Germany is kind of that stereotypical like business city. So they're going to do lots of corporate travel, right? Munich, on the other hand, is much more of, I would say, kind of a cultural attraction, a leisure attraction. They've obviously got Oktoberfest. They've got the whole Bavarian culture thing going on. So it's much more so of like a leisure tourist destination. And before we set up this call, me and Blake were looking into, okay, what are two good cities to compare? And these two really fit the bill because that difference in that kind of personality between the two cities, the more leisure, the more business centric city, that really shows up in a lot of the segmentation data. So if you look at things like, Munich's transient versus group versus Frankfurt's transient and group, it kind of shows up in the data there where, it's kind of what you would expect, right? Like it's a little bit more heavy on like the group segment in Frankfurt as opposed to Munich, which is a little bit more leisure heavy. And then you have some ADR premiums in Frankfurt that, it's likely indicative that that market's doing a lot of higher ADR, corporate group stays, and more corporate travel.
Yep, totally. Yep, and again, let's just dive into this transient for a second. So Frankfurt last year 147, and then 102 for Munich, and then again 151 to 121. So in this situation, again, Munich is trailing, but you could see here the delta is 45. Is 45 versus here the delta is 30. So if you're Munich, while you're still trailing, you are gaining ground, right? So that is kind of the story here, is that, again, it's contextualizing what you typically were in the past and where you are now. Because despite the fact that you're still behind Frankfurt, if you're Munich, you're feeling pretty good about this, right? If you're Frankfurt, Daniel, are you concerned, or well, you can see they only drove their up 4 versus here up 19, right? So if you're Munich, sorry, if you're Frankfurt, are you concerned about this?
Potentially, but at the same time, these two markets in a lot of cases are going for different guests, right? They're competing for different guests. And actually, towards the end of this presentation, Blake, we're going to look at some markets that you would think should be looking at each other, but actually may not be the best like apples to apples comparison. So in this case, I think it's promising that Munich is seeing that really good ADR growth. And if I were Munich or if I were Frankfurt, I would include the other city just for comparison's sake, but with very much a grain of salt, right? Knowing that we're competing for two very different guests in these two markets.
Totally. And you know what else is interesting about this? And this is kind of giving the crowd, the audience, a little bit of insider baseball. Like this data changes constantly. So when we're prepping for these presentations, we're looking at the data every couple of days and just kind of staying current on it. But so much of what we looked at this data a couple of days ago when it was different, and now it's different again. So honestly, this just kind of goes to show how critical it is for you to stay up on this, work with your hotel partners, strategize with the hotels in your market, because this data is changing constantly. You book one big group, that as a high rated group or frankly a lower rated group, that's going to drive your occupancy and rate and your pickup. Like here, you look at this type of data, you can kind of see where your ADR pickup is. This is 24-hour pickup, so you can see Frankfurt's picked up very little, Munich 31. So you can kind of see just how much this is how much change over the last day. And as you're kind of working with your hotel partners, figuring out how you're going to attract the groups to maximize your bottom line. One more kind of comparison we want to look at, and this is going to be for markets that on the surface probably look like they're probably pretty good, comparable markets, but maybe once we kind of peel back the hood, not exactly the case. So for this one, we're going to go to our pricing dashboard. Okay. So here we're going to look at, again, this is all part of the data solutions platform. This is the pricing one. And what we're going to do is we have Seattle pulled up here. And what I want to also do is pull up Seattle here as well as San Francisco. And that's going to put both cities on kind of one of these charts I want to look at. Okay. So, Daniel, on the surface, Seattle, San Francisco, right? These feel on the surface like these are fairly similar cities, similar destinations. These are like tech cities. They're very, they're higher end cities. So on the surface, they're both in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. So on the surface, I think these probably look like these would be pretty interesting and comparable destinations. And again, you can compare anything when you contextualize it, but like, let's peel back the layers first off. So Daniel, let's start with this one, this average price change versus 30 days ago. So this just kind of sets the tone for how each city is trending over the last, month. And so, for example, you can see San Francisco down less than 1%, Seattle about triple that because they're about 2.4% down. San Francisco is not trending downward as much. Daniel, anything else you see here that you want to point out?
Yeah, as we were prepping this, we kind of talked through these two different markets and like what makes them click, what's different about each of these markets. And just from my experience, working with our RSS team up here at Lighthouse, and we've got a lot of hotels in both of these markets. These, again, they seem like they would be two really good markets to compare against each other, but really the event calendar is extremely different in a
Mm-hmm.
city like Seattle and a city like San Francisco. So San Francisco, I would say, has a much more high ADR, higher stakes, tech convention based kind of calendar, right? Think about all the things that go on in San Francisco with JP Morgan Health and then Dreamforce, and you've got all these really, really high ADR events that come through to the market. Now, Seattle also gets, lots of sports games and lots of concerts and stuff like that, but it's just a little bit different. And we'll see, especially with the pricing evolution chart that we look at here in just a second, just how different kind of the personality of these two cities is, right? They price almost completely differently than each other. And I
Totally.
think it has to do with that. I think it has to do with the event calendar is very, very important here. But yeah, really fascinating. So if I were a San Francisco, I might opt to put something like New York as a good comparison for my destination,
Mm-hmm.
more so than Seattle. I might still include Seattle just because you're going to get a lot of the same concerts and sporting events and stuff like that. But, I wouldn't use it as my exclusive benchmark if I were San Fran as a destination.
Yep. And Daniel, great segue to this lead time chart. So this again is critical data for destinations, right? Because what we see here on the bottom left, price difference versus final price. I'm going to walk everyone through it if you're not familiar with this type of chart, just so you understand what we're looking at. So this is how hotel prices are evolving based on lead time. So 120 days, 4 months ahead of time. 0 is booking on the stay date itself. So this chart will always resolve to 0. And this is basically how price looks indexed to final price. Final price, again, is always going to index at 0% to itself because that's what it will resolve to. And so, just for example, this is saying that at the 4 month lead time mark, hotels in Seattle are pricing around 3% higher than where it will finalize at, whereas hotels in San Francisco are pricing almost 4% below where it will ultimately finalize. And San Francisco's pricing actually, the discount grows to a max of about 50 days ahead of time, 7.5% roughly. So, and at that point, where San Francisco is 7.5% below where it'll finalize, Seattle's less than 1% below where it will finalize. And Seattle does grow, and you can see the charts almost link up a little bit here, and they kind of have a very similar evolution over the last week or so. But getting to that point is very different. So again, contextualizing what we were talking about before and looking at what rate is on the books at that moment, what occupancy is on the books, looking at evolution charts from both a rate perspective and an occupancy perspective, because that allows you to understand, I know that you're currently pricing ahead of me, but that's okay because I know that I'm giving it a lot more rooms that are booking last minute, and those are generally higher rated rooms because you can kind of see how your evolution curve is. So that's critical information for destinations as they're benchmarking and seeing how they're trending for certain stay dates against their competitors. Danielle, what else do you see?
Yeah, that's the big thing, and it ties back to kind of that first example that we looked at between Dallas and Houston. When you benchmark against these other destinations, it's useful to benchmark against them for somewhat extended periods of time because then you get an opportunity to learn what the trends are. Okay, what's the personality of this other destination? How do they price? What does their supply look like? What's their mixture of group and transient? And then over time, you'll start to build these indicators and learn these indicators and kind of what they mean for your destination. You learn what's normal, you learn what's not normal, and it's nice to compare yourself against a lot of different destinations to kind of get all that information, glean it all, put it all together, and just know more in general about what's going on versus your competitive set.
Fantastic. Well, listen, everybody, I made it through the whole show without coughing. That's pretty good. One cough. Thank you guys all for joining. In a few moments, you're going to see a thing pop on your screen. If there's a way that we can help you, support you, show you a bit more about the product, there's going to be a little screen that pops up. You can just hit yes, and someone from our team will reach out to you directly and talk through your needs as a destination, as a hotelier, and talk through how Lighthouse can support. So all you got to do is click that. But otherwise, today we covered a lot of good ground, how to select a comp set, how to look at destinations that are proximate, how to factor in segmentation, how to also just understand how prices are evolving and just look at cities that might be similar on the surface, but actually underneath the hood have a lot of differences and contextualizing. That's the key, is contextualizing everything you see. So it has been an absolute pleasure presenting for you guys today. We hope you found this valuable and enjoyable. Until next time, my name is Blake Ryder.
I'm Daniel Foreman.
And this has been The Dirt.
The Dirt. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, guys.